This channel grows one subscriber at a time. Be the one who helps us reach 1K. Hit that button now. Not 3%, not 8%. Every time researchers sequence this population's DNA, one number keeps surfacing. Over a third of maternal lineages tracing back to East Africa, roughly matched in scale by paternal lineages tracing straight to the Arabian Peninsula. Same population, same passports. Two completely different geographic stories depending on which parent you inherited from. Picture the imbalance. On one side of the family tree, near total uniformity, a single genetic signature, repeated generation after generation, like a stamp pressed into the same wax 1,000 times. On the other side, something closer to a patchwork quilt, stitched from continents that, on paper, this population's history books barely mention. Geneticists studying this small Gulf nation, a citizenry numbering only in the low hundreds of thousands, have identified at least 3 distinct ancestral clusters coexisting inside it. Not 3 clusters across the region, 3 clusters inside one national bloodline. Here is the part that should stop you. This is a population that overwhelmingly identifies as belonging to unified Arab Bedouin tribal lines. One people, one lineage, one story of descent. And yet the genome tells a story of at least 3 separate continents converging, not in some distant antiquity, but within the span of a few living generations. Grandparents. Not ancestors from 1,000 years back. Grandparents. So if you found out tomorrow that your grandfather's Y chromosome pointed to one continent and your grandmother's mitochondrial DNA pointed to another entirely, which one would you believe was really your family? To understand how a genome ends up this fractured, you have to start with the story this population tells about itself. Because for over 2 centuries, it has been a remarkably consistent one. The accepted account goes like this. The population of this peninsula descends from a small number of founding Arab tribes who settled its coastline and interior beginning roughly in the 1700s. These aren't vague, faceless ancestors. They have names still spoken today. Al-Sultan, Al-Mahanda, Al-Sudan, Hamaidat, Al-Buainain, Al-Bin Ali, Bu-Kuwara, Al-Muhannadi, Al-Manai, Al-Sulaiti, Al-Sada, Al-Khulaifat, Al-Busamait, Al-Buainain, Al-Kubaisi, Al-Humaidat, Al-Atiyah. Several of these names aren't just family records. They're still stamped onto neighborhoods of the old capital today. Walk through certain districts of Doha and you're walking through a tribal register. As Salata, Al-Khulaifat. Names on street signs that are also names in family trees going back 300 years. The traditional social architecture split cleanly in 2. There were the Hadar, settled, coastal, town-dwelling tribes whose lives ran on the rhythm of the sea. Pearl diving, fishing, coastal trade, maritime transport. And there were the Bedouin, interior tribes who herded camels, sheep, and goats, moving seasonally into the desert as the temperature dropped, sometimes drifting toward the coast themselves in the cooler months. 2 lifestyles, 2 economies, one tribal identity holding them together. Marriage reinforced that identity by design. First cousin unions and within-tribe marriage weren't an accident of a small population. They were policy, a deliberate mechanism for keeping land, lineage, and tribal loyalty intact across generations. For over 200 years, this is simply how the story is told. Closed, coherent, self-contained. And there's a piece of that story that sounds, on its surface, like it should explain everything researchers eventually found strange. This coastline was never isolated. It sat at a crossroads. Pearling economies here fed directly into trade networks stretching to Persia, to India, to East Africa. Merchants came and went, ships loaded pearls in local harbors and unloaded them on foreign shores. None of that contradicts the tribal story. If anything, it seems to explain, in advance, why a bit of foreign blood might show up somewhere in the family tree. Except that's not what the researchers found, not a bit. Not a rounding error you could file away as background noise from centuries of trade. Here is where it gets complicated. When teams began actually sequencing this population's genome, not asking families what they believed about their own ancestry, but reading it directly off their chromosomes, the tribal story didn't collapse. But it stopped being sufficient. Something kept showing up in the data that the tribal registers never mentioned, in proportions too large to be a rounding error and too consistent across study after study to be a fluke of one bad sample. The tribal story explains almost everything about who lives here, except for the one number that keeps refusing to fit the frame. That number has a name now, or rather 3 names. Whole genome sequencing consistently splits this population into 3 distinct ancestral genetic clusters. Not one. Researchers label them Q1, Q2, and Q3. Q1 traces to Bedouin and broader Arab ancestry. Q2 traces to Persian and South Asian populations. Q3 traces to sub-Saharan Africa. 3 genomes worth of history, sitting inside one national identity. The most credible source on this is Juan Rodriguez Flores, who led an international research team based at Weill Cornell Medicine, Qatar. His team sequenced the full genomes of more than 1,000 people from this population and found roughly 26 million points where their DNA differed from the standard human reference genome, a difference so substantial that the team built an entirely new reference genome, the Qatar genome, specifically calibrated to this population. That work was published in the journal Human Genome Variation in 2016. It wasn't the first team to notice the fracture. Back in 2010, a study titled Population Genetic Structure of the People of Qatar, led by researchers including Hunter Zink, genotyped 168 self-identified nationals in the capital using high-density SNP arrays. Their conclusion, in their own words, this is a population representing a relatively recent founding by a small number of families from 3 tribes of the Arabian Peninsula, Persia, and Oman, with indications of African admixture. Recent, not ancient, recent. 2 years later, in 2012, a team led by Omberg published a study in BMC Genomic Data using a machine learning method called SupportMix, essentially a genetic detective tool built to trace which of 55 different reference populations around the world any given stretch of a person's DNA most closely resembles. Applied to 156 individuals from this population, it found that 88.5%, give or take about 8 percentage points, of the ancestry sampled was broadly Middle Eastern, but that broad label was hiding its own fracture. Within it, only 63.2%, give or take 12 points, specifically matched Bedouin reference populations. Even the Middle Eastern umbrella wasn't one thing, it had its own internal seams. And here's where the story bends in a direction the tribal registers never anticipated. The Persian genetic component doesn't trace back to one clean, ancient migration. It lines up with 2 very different, much more recent historical threads. 1. A wave of Persian migrants displaced by famine in the late 1800s. 2. And this is the twist the tribal story conveniently leaves out, a centuries-long back-and-forth movement of Arab families known as the Huwala, who settled on the Persian coast for generations before some of them returned to the Arabian side. Meaning some of what shows up in the DNA as Persian isn't foreign blood at all. It's recycled Arab blood. Families who spent 100, sometimes 200 years living on the wrong side of the Gulf before coming home. Some of the very same tribes held up as the founding families of this peninsula had branches living as expatriates in Iran within the last 2 centuries. Not by years, by centuries. The African cluster complicates things further, and in a more specific direction than anyone initially assumed. The SupportMix analysis didn't just confirm an African signal, it traced that signal specifically to sub-Saharan and East African origins, not the Southern African Bantu populations some earlier researchers had guessed at. That specificity narrows the timeline. It points directly toward the historical Indian Ocean and Gulf trade routes of the 18th through early 20th centuries, the same era, not coincidentally, as the pearling economy's peak. And layered on top of all 3 clusters is something that should have made this kind of diversity impossible to sustain: consanguinity. Studies document rates of first cousin and within-tribe marriage as high as 54% in some subgroups, a level of intermarriage that produces unusually long, unbroken stretches of identical genetic material passed down the line, a hallmark of extreme, recent isolation. Researchers are careful to frame this as a statistical pattern rather than a certainty about any individual family. But the pattern itself is stark. 3 continents worth of ancestry, locked inside a gene pool that should have been sealed shut generations ago. 3 ancestries. 1 flag. A consanguinity rate that, by every normal rule of population genetics, should have erased this kind of diversity generations ago instead of preserving it in plain sight. Something doesn't add up, and the first explanation researchers reached for only solves part of it. The first explanation is the tidy one: trade. For decades, the working theory has been straightforward. This coastline's economy ran on pearling, and pearling built a maritime trade network stretching to Persia, to India, to East Africa. Local pearls moved through ports like Bandar Lenge on the Persian coast for processing and export, and that same commercial current pulled in Persian merchants, divers, and laborers, while parallel Indian Ocean trade routes brought East African labor into the same pearling economy. Under this theory, the Q2 and Q3 clusters aren't a mystery at all. They're simply the genetic residue of centuries of ordinary commerce. The engine behind the Persian cluster, historians argue, is the documented Huwala migration pattern. Sunni Arab tribal families who relocated to the southern Iranian coast in the 17th and 18th centuries, specifically to work the pearling trade, some of whom later moved back. This wasn't a rumor or a guess. British Gulf Administrator J.G. Lorimer's early 20th century survey recorded roughly 2,000 Huwala living in the towns of Doha and Al-Waqra alone by that period. A concrete number, on paper, for how large this trade migration population really was on the ground. It's a clean theory, almost too clean, because pure trade-driven migration should leave a shallow, symmetrical footprint, merchants and laborers of both sexes arriving over a documented handful of generations, some marrying in, some marrying out, leaving behind a genetic signature that looks roughly the same whether you trace it through the mother's line or the father's. Researchers are careful to frame this as probability rather than proof, but the actual data doesn't cooperate with that expectation. The Y chromosome, the genetic marker passed almost unchanged from father to son, like a name stamped down through generations of men, is overwhelmingly dominated by a single lineage, the J1 haplogroup, common across Semitic-speaking Arab populations. There is almost none of the diversity you'd expect to find if large numbers of Persian and African men had been marrying into this population at anywhere near the rate the whole genome data implies. Trade, trade, trade. That's the explanation offered again and again for how this admixture got here. But trade doesn't explain why it only shows up on one side of the family tree. If merchants and laborers of both sexes had been marrying in for 2 centuries, the male lineage should look just as mixed as the whole genome data does. It doesn't. It looks almost untouched, which means whatever brought 3 continents into this gene pool did not move through this population evenly. It moved through one door and largely skipped the other. Trade explains why the DNA is there. It does not explain why it only shows up on one side of the family tree. And that asymmetry points to something far more specific and far harder to say out loud than merchants simply passing through a port. That something more specific has a name: sex-biased admixture. It's a clinical term for a brutally simple pattern. The DNA doesn't just show that other continents entered this population, it shows how they entered, broken down by sex. A genome is really 2 separate archives running in parallel, one written down the paternal line, largely unchanged from father to son, like initials carved into a tree that gets taller but keeps the same carving. The other written down the maternal line, mother to daughter, recording an entirely separate migration history. When those 2 archives tell wildly different stories, geneticists don't call that a coincidence. They call it a signature. And the signature here points to African and Persian ancestry entering this population disproportionately through women. Not symmetrically, not through both sexes at once, but through one door. Line that up against the historical record already on the table, and it stops looking abstract. Gulf households across the 18th to early 20th centuries are documented to have incorporated East African women through domestic labor and the region's slave trade, a demographic channel that, by its very nature, leaves almost no mark on the Y chromosome because it wasn't moving men into the population, but a heavy, permanent mark on mitochondrial DNA because it was moving women in. Researchers examining Qatari mitochondrial diversity have found African-associated maternal lineages accounting for more than 1/3 of all lineages sampled, a proportion researchers are careful to frame as a documented pattern rather than a settled percentage, but a proportion that lines up, almost too neatly, with the near-total dominance of a single lineage on the paternal side. The broader sequencing effort behind these findings, the Qatar Genome Program, run out of Weill Cornell Medicine Qatar in coordination with Hamad Medical Corporation in Doha, is what made a pattern like this visible at population scale in the first place. And here's the part that quietly finishes off Theory 1. Trade, by definition, is a 2-way mixed-sex phenomenon. Merchants, laborers, sailors, buyers, sellers, moving in and out of a port city over generations, some marrying in, some marrying out, in numbers roughly proportional across sexes. That kind of history produces a genome that looks mixed on both lines, evenly. It does not produce this. A signature this lopsided doesn't say, traders settled here. It says something structurally asymmetric happened, something that moved African ancestry into households through one specific channel, largely bypassing the other. The Pearling Hub story isn't wrong. It's just no longer sufficient. A trade route can explain strangers arriving. It cannot, by itself, explain why only one half of their DNA made it into the next generation. And that detail forces the story somewhere the tribal narrative never wanted to go. There's a third possibility, and it's the one modern researchers studying this population are the most careful about. Sex-biased admixture explains the shape of the imbalance. It doesn't explain the timeline. And when researchers try to pin that timeline down, the data resists a single date the way a smudged photograph resists a single face. The leading, more unsettling theory holds that this wasn't one wave of incorporation. It was several, stacked across nearly 2 centuries, each one leaving its own trace, and all of them now genetically fused into what looks, on a modern sequencer, like a single continuous signal. One wave tied to the pearling boom of the 1800s, a later wave tied to the oil-driven urbanization of the 20th century, when this small coastal economy transformed almost overnight and pulled in labor from across the region. Different decades, different circumstances, same genetic bucket. Make it worse, this was already a small founding population, a handful of families from a handful of tribes. In a population that size, even a modest wave of incorporation doesn't get diluted the way it would in a country of tens of millions. It gets amplified. Every new lineage that entered had an outsized statistical footprint on the whole. And once it entered, the population's well-documented consanguinity, first cousin and within-tribe marriage running as high as 54% in some studied subgroups, locked it in place, generation after generation, the way tree rings lock in a single, unusually dry year, long after the weather itself is forgotten. Researchers are the first to admit they can't cleanly separate these waves. Long runs of homozygosity and layered admixture signals, in a population this small and this endogamous, blur multiple historical episodes into what reads, genetically, as a single event. This is the part the records don't explain. Not because no one has looked, because the very mechanism that preserved this ancestry, tight, closed marriage patterns, is the same mechanism that erased the seams between one historical episode and the next. Which raises a harder question than any percentage on a lab report. If the African ancestry here isn't one migration but many, arriving across 2 centuries and then sealed inside a closed gene pool by tribal endogamy, at what point does admixture from trade stop being an adequate description of where this population actually comes from? Whatever the real number of separate historical episodes was, they all funneled into the same tightly closed gene pool. And to understand what that actually felt like on the ground, you have to go back to the ports where it happened. Picture the stone jetty at Doha's old pearling harbor, sometime in the 1920s. Before oil, when a single export decided whether a family ate that year, pearls. Every summer, this economy performed the same ritual. The diving season, al-Gauz in the local Arabic, emptied coastal towns of nearly every able-bodied man for months at a stretch. Fleets numbering in the hundreds of boats pushed out from harbors like this one, crewed by divers who would spend entire days free diving to oyster beds on nothing but held breath and a nose clip, hauling up baskets of shell in water thick with the very real risk of sharks and the slow physical toll of repeated deep dives without equipment. Stand on that jetty and look at who's actually working it. Huwala families, only a generation or two removed from lives on the Persian coast, hauling rope alongside Bedouin-descended tribal divers whose families had never left the peninsula. African laborers, integrated into ship crews and into the households those crews came home to. Persian merchants on the dock, financing the season before it started and buying the haul once it came in. And running underneath almost every one of those working relationships, a debt, the salaf system, cash advanced against a season's future catch, binding a diver to his captain in an arrangement historians have described as functioning, for many men, close to bonded labor. None of this was abstract. None of it was ancestry happening somewhere else, to someone else, in the past tense. It was standing on that jetty in the flesh. Households in that single generation already carrying every layer the DNA studies would find a century later, related to the family in the next house by blood, by marriage, and by debt. Sometimes all three folded into the same relationship. That harbor scene is the last version of this population before everything changed forever. Because the discovery that follows didn't just complicate the trade story. It rewrote what tribe even meant here. Here's the discovery. A Bayesian analysis of gene flow across this population identified something researchers hadn't been looking for. A primary migration corridor running from Yemen to Kuwait, passing directly through this peninsula. A route stretching across the entire Arabian Peninsula, far older and far larger than any single founding story of local tribes settling a stretch of coastline. Sit with what that actually means. The Q1 cluster, The Bedouin Arab lineage this entire investigation has been treating as the fixed point, the stable native baseline against which the Persian and African admixture was being measured, is not fixed at all. It is itself a downstream product of a peninsula-wide corridor with no single point of origin. There was no ancient, undisturbed founding population sitting still on this coastline, later diluted by outside arrivals. The uniformity in the male lineage that Theory 1 and Theory 2 both leaned on as evidence of a stable Arab core turns out to be evidence of something else entirely. One exceptionally successful lineage sweeping the length of the peninsula, from Yemen through Kuwait, of which the tribes on this coastline are simply one downstream branch among many. The founder effect and the consanguinity data don't contradict this. They explain how it happened. A small number of founding families, heavy intermarriage, long, unbroken runs of identical genetic material. That combination doesn't just preserve isolation. It lets one incoming patrilineal lineage dominate a population's entire male ancestry within a handful of generations, even while unrelated maternal lineages kept entering the same households from Persia and from East Africa the whole time, on an entirely separate current, not settled, swept through the tribal Arab core that this story treated, from the very first minutes, as the ancient fixed reference point, the baseline everything else was measured against, is itself migratory, itself recent, no more original to this stretch of coastline than the Persian ancestry or the African ancestry it was supposedly diluting. One researcher working with Qatari genomic data has described the moment this becomes clear to a family reviewing their own results. In plain terms, there is no baseline here. Every line you thought was fixed turns out to be moving too. If even the native bloodline turns out to be a migration route wearing a tribal name, then the real question was never which ancestry belongs here. It's whether that question ever made sense to begin with. Widen the lens far enough, and this stops being a story about one small Gulf nation at all. Every population on Earth that calls itself indigenous, native, or original to a piece of land is, at some depth of genetic resolution, a snapshot of a migration still mid-motion, a river photographed at one instant and mistaken by the people standing in it for something still. The only thing unusual about this population is how closely it's been studied, and therefore how visibly the layers show. Founder effects. Endogamy, sex-biased historical admixture. None of it is unique to this coastline. It's simply been sequenced here with unusual intensity, which raises an uncomfortable question about every other ancient, settled population that hasn't been sequenced nearly as closely yet. How many of them are hiding the exact same layered river, just weights-hang photographed? Go back to where this started. A single number, over a third of maternal lineages tracing to a continent the national story never mentions. That number was never really about statistics. It's about what happens to a community's sense of itself the moment the measurable evidence and the inherited story stop agreeing. When the archive written in the body and the archive written in memory tell two different histories of the same people. No single theory here closes the case. Not the trade routes, not the sex-biased admixture, not the layered waves of incorporation stacked across 2 centuries, not the ancient corridor running from Yemen to Kuwait. The honest answer is almost certainly some combination of all 4, in proportions no study has yet measured with certainty. A palimpsest, one history written over another, then another. None of them fully erased. All of them still faintly legible underneath the others if you know how to read for it. The Qatari were never who they thought they were. And the DNA, layer by unfinished layer, still isn't done revealing the truth.